Hello, I'm Julia Court, co-executive producer of Nova. On behalf of my co-EP Chris Schmidt and myself, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us for this special screening and conversation. At Nova, we're committed to exploring the science that impacts all our lives, and that's why we're so excited to be bringing you The Cannabis Question next Wednesday, September 29th on Nebraska Public Media. We wanted to make this film because although millions of Americans are now using cannabis, and pretty much everyone has an opinion about it, we realize that a lot of us don't necessarily know what science has learned about this plant and how it affects us. And as we researched this film and found out more, we discovered how complicated the story of cannabis really is. A lot of you might have heard of THC and CBD, but we found that the cannabis plant contains dozens of compounds that interact with a key system in our bodies. We learned that while there's a multi-billion-dollar industry marketing cannabis to consumers, there is only one cannabis-derived drug that has been approved by the FDA. And at the same time, the criminalization of cannabis continues to have a devastating impact, especially on communities of color. It's so important that as we all are making decisions about what kinds of policies we want around cannabis in our communities and in the country, and in some cases, whether and how we want to use cannabis products, it's so important that we all have reliable, accurate information about this plant, what its potential benefits are, and its risks. We're so grateful to PBS, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the Nova Science Trust, and the George D. Smith Fund for making this film possible. And we're extremely thankful for the wonderful partnership we've had this year with Nebraska Public Media, creating science content that is meaningful to this community. I want to extend a special thank you to Maggie Burnt from NPM and to Gina Baramo from Nova for all their work organizing this event. Most of all, thank you to all of you for joining this important conversation about cannabis in Nebraska. Now I'd like to hand things over to our moderator for this evening's discussion, Nebraska Public Media News Director, Dennis Kellogg.
Thank you so much, Julia, and welcome everyone to Cannabis in Nebraska, Medicine, Agriculture, and the Law. I'm Dennis Kellogg, News Director at Nebraska Public Media, and we are pleased to partner with Nova to present this special preview of their new film, The Cannabis Question, which premieres on Wednesday, September 29th at 8 p.m. Central on Nebraska Public Media or online on Nova's website or YouTube channel. Tonight, we're going to be watching some excerpts from the film and discussing the local impact here in Nebraska with a panel of experts. Joining me today are Sarah Holt, producer, director, and writer of The Cannabis Question. Her award-winning work for PBS has covered science, history, and medicine. Some of her most recent films for Nova are Decoding COVID-19, The Truth About Fat, and Addiction. Dr. Yasmin Hurd is the director of the Addiction Institute at Mount Sinai in New York, and she's featured in The Cannabis Question as well. Her research investigates the neurobiology underlying addiction disorders, and a major recent focus has been developmental exposure to drugs of abuse, like cannabis. Dr. Andrea Holmes is professor of chemistry and director of Doane University's new Cannabis Studies Department. Her research includes developing automated systems for counting yeast and mold colonies in cannabis plants. She's also active in the cannabis industry, and she has analyzed and tested cannabis-derived consumer products for quality, served as a consultant and an expert, and is the founder and owner of several cannabis businesses herself. And Dr. Kelly Dineen is the director of the Health Law Policy Program at Creighton University Law School. Before attending law school, she was a practicing nurse for over a decade. Her research covers the impacts of decisions of lawmakers, policymakers, and providers of healthcare quality, with a particular focus on opioid and drug policy and people with highly stigmatized conditions, including addiction. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. And before we begin, a note to our audience. We hope to hear from all of you. If you have questions for our panel, please share them in the Q&A here in Zoom. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible throughout tonight's discussion. Cannabis is a complicated topic, and it is increasingly impacting medicine, agriculture, and the criminal justice system. Federally, cannabis is still a Schedule I drug, but it is increasingly becoming decriminalized at the state level. There is increasing demand for cannabis products, but there are rules and regulations in place that make it difficult for farmers to grow and process. People can purchase CBD wellness products in stores, but often those have not undergone a rigorous testing or quality control process. And hundreds of thousands of people are arrested for marijuana possession every year. So we're going to watch the prologue of the film, The Cannabis Question, which lays out these questions and complications, and then we can hear more from the film's director, writer, and producer, Sarah Holt. So that's The Cannabis Question, and Sarah Holt is a writer, producer, and director. And Sarah, I want to start with you. That clip sets up many of the themes of the film. So what were some of the findings that maybe surprised you as you made this film?
I think one thing that surprised me initially is that cannabis is not one thing. There are 500 chemicals in the plant, along with cannabinoids. There are 144 cannabinoids, not just the ones we all know, THC and CBD. And I began to realize that there's so many factors. People would say to me, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Should I be using it? Should I not? And it really depends on, are you a teen? Are you an adult and your brain is fully formed? Are you using it every day? Are you using it occasionally? Are you taking a high dose or a low dose? So there were so many things to consider that I realized cannabis is not one thing. It's incredibly complicated, and it made the show complicated because I wasn't sure, should I be looking at medicinal use, recreational use? There are just so many facets to the plant, high CBD products, high THC products. So that was the first thing that really struck me, was it was not a simple story to tell.
And as you said, it's such a broad topic. So if you were going to make a part two of this film, what are some of the vast areas that we could still explore with cannabis?
Well, to me, one of the most interesting things, and we'll talk to Dr. Hurd about this, was learning about the endocannabinoid system, that we make our own cannabis-like molecules. And it's a system that is so important. It controls memory, cognition, pain, appetite. I mean, it's one of the most important regulatory systems that few people have heard of. And cannabis activates this system. So to me, I was just beginning to try to understand this system. And I think scientists, I mean, Dr. Hurd could speak to this. I think scientists are just beginning to unscratch the surface of this system and to find out the role it might play in diseases and in keeping us healthy.
Dr.
Its key function is keeping us in balance, keeping everything in balance.
Well, Dr. Yasmin Hurd, let's bring you into the conversation right now. Thanks for being with us. And have you seen interest in your research into cannabis change, especially with the rise of CBD?
Oh my goodness. Well, first of all, thanks for having me as part of the discussion. When I first started studying cannabis, people told me, why am I studying this? One, it is not addictive, so why are you wasting your time studying it? And I had actually started studying it on the developing brain, and they were like, again, I'm studying it in the developing brain, but studying them as adults later to see the long-term effects. And people were just like, you're not going to get grants to fund your research. And when I started looking at CBD in our animal models, and then we saw that it actually had indications that it would reduce heroin-seeking behavior in our animals. Again, people are like, what is CBD? And now fast forward, a decade later, and I'm on a program like this in Sarah's documentary, and the interest in our research has skyrocketed. But, the endocannabinoid system, cannabis has been studied. Many people think in our society for like decades and, even thousands of years because the plant has been around for so long. But actually, in reality, there's not that much detailed research, in-depth research into cannabis. We definitely have a better understanding of our endocannabinoid system. But even that now, as Sarah said, we've only scratched the surface. There's so many receptors that we don't even, we haven't characterized, but we know they exist. And these are the things that are fascinating for us as scientists. But it's also disturbing because now we have a whole society bombarded with cannabis and cannabinoid products that we completely don't understand the full impact, both good and bad, on the brain and body.
Well, Dr. Andrea Holmes of Doane University in Nebraska, we'll talk to you. Thank you for joining us as well. Talk about the demand for more training and information about cannabis that drove Doane to create a cannabis studies focus.
Yes, I mean, as you just heard from Sarah and Yasmin, the cannabis field is unbelievably complex and rich, and there's just so much to be learned. And as we've seen in the introduction film, it's $1 billion industry, and it's rapidly growing in all over the world. And what we don't yet have is enough education and knowledge, and there's a really great opportunity for people to enter into this field, make great salaries, provide for their communities and their families, but oftentimes it requires very specialized knowledge, and the specialized knowledge people are hungry for. So Doane University really took an interest in this because I became very interested in this, because when I entered into this industry, I realized, wow, we need to do something from an educational standpoint. And when we launched our program, the first courses we built were online courses, certification courses, and we had thousands and thousands and thousands of people register for these courses from all over the world. And it was an instant hit for us. And that's when we recognized there is a market. We need to build more courses and get more people involved and bring more subject matter experts. And the demand is quite significant, so significant that other universities now have asked to partner with us and build joint degree programs.
Dr. Kelly Dineen, the director of the Health Law Policy Program at Creighton University in Nebraska. Overall, what are some of the trends among the states that are decriminalizing cannabis in some way? We're starting to see more and more of that. Are you seeing any trends develop?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you for having me, but it's an honor to be on this panel. But what we saw is in the 70s, there were a handful of states, and Nebraska was one of them, that decriminalized in some fashion, right? Whether it was lesser penalties or programs, diversionary programs, or considering them infractions only and not a felony. But that was only, I believe, 11 states. So then you see a sharp rise in decriminalization that corresponds with, of course, the trends toward medical marijuana programs and special access programs in states, right? And then shortly thereafter followed by those states where it is legal, right? Then you don't have the same issues with decriminalization per se. It's just expanded rapidly, and unfortunately, we haven't seen the same changes with decriminalization in terms of disparities, in terms of arrest or prosecutions of related offenses. But there certainly is a trend to decriminalize because that arrest and prosecution has a number of waves that flow from it, right? So it's not just an arrest, you're a felon then. So you've got job implications, there's family implications, right? There's child abuse and neglect implications, right? Housing issues. And so it really does affect you in all aspects of life for a very long time.
And we're going to explore more about that as we go on with this discussion throughout the night. But as a reminder, if you have questions about the film or for any of our panelists, please put them in the chat. And we're starting to get some of those questions now. So we'll be getting to those shortly. Next, we're going to watch 2 short clips from the show back to back that focus on the medical aspect of cannabis. In these clips, we're going to learn a little bit more about the body's endocannabinoid system and how that can have a positive impact on conditions like PTSD. And then we'll get a glimpse into some of the studies into how cannabis exposure negatively impacts the developing brain. So, Dr. Yasmin Hurd, we saw you in that clip, and I want to kind of jump off that and follow up with you a little bit and ask you a few of these questions. Recent studies have shown that cannabis use is rising among teenagers. The National Institute of Drug Abuse just published a study that says 44% of college students reported using marijuana in 2020. So what are the neurological risks to those in their teens and early adults that they should be concerned about if they're going to be using cannabis?
So I think that I think Sarah mentioned it earlier. One of the things that we know is that the developing brain is perhaps most vulnerable to cannabis, more so than even the adult brain. And one of the reasons is, and it showed in the last piece there, is that you have to remember development is a dynamic process. It's a beautiful process. It's, the blueprint by which we are all formed, but it's changing all the time. And the endocannabinoid system is a critical part, even from prenatal development. It is important for hardwiring of the brain. The circuits that are made are guided by our natural endocannabinoid system. Similarly, during adolescence, when we're having this pruning to really improve the efficiency with which we, as adults, think and make decisions, those are regulated by the endocannabinoid system. So now that we have teens that are using THC, and I will say, or cannabis, I will say one of the things that we see why over time there are greater problems with cannabis and cannabis use disorders is because of the THC potency. So during adolescence, as a SAD, the endocannabinoid system critical for helping to fine-tune, mature the brain to be as efficient as it can be during adulthood. And now you have very high potent THC, really, and I use the word hammer, that is a really strong hammer on the brain. Our endogenous cannabinoids never get to the level of THC. And now you have, as I said, in more recent years, increase in the potency of THC in the cannabis that is being, sold in many products. So that is the issue. And the brain takes a while to develop, actually. It's not until like mid-20s that we gain full maturity. So this is the problem that we see, and we see definitely greater psychiatric problems. And for me, I think it comes back down to the potency of the cannabis today that the teens and young adults are being exposed to.
So, Sarah Holt, the film also shows how some researchers looking into how cannabis exposure potentially affects the cognitive development of even younger children. And Nicole writes in a question. She says, as I understand there is impact on a developing brain when using cannabis, would there be risk versus reward when discussing seizures and epilepsy in youth? And I know you get into that a little bit in the film. Can you talk about that?
I'm sorry, you broke up, so I couldn't totally hear the question. Are you asking me if high potency cannabis can increase the risk of seizures? Was that the question?
Well, Nicole's asking about the risk versus reward for somebody who's considering children or young adults using cannabis, maybe to help with epilepsy, but then also there's this potential effect on the brain.
Right, but the epilepsy studies are using CBD, which is non-psychoactive. So I think there's strong evidence for a certain type of epilepsy, CBD can reduce seizures, not in all types of epilepsy, but that's not looking at THC and recreational use. So I think the instances where parents are turning to CBD for things like epilepsy, or even we looked at a clinical trial in the film to see if CBD could help with severe autism. And we didn't get the data because COVID delayed the trial moving forward. But those children are being given CBD, not THC. It's a very different exposure. And CBD is relatively safe, and it doesn't impact cognition the way THC can.
Andrea Holmes, I want to bring you into this as well. Can you, as we look at other topics involved around this as well, can you define or at least start to give us an overview of the types of cannabinoids that the cannabis plant produces and how they are chemically distinct and how they interact with the body?
Sure. So I like calling cannabis a pharma factory. And the reason why is because there's hundreds of cannabinoids in there. There are hundreds of terpenes. Terpenes are very bioactive and functional molecules. They give the cannabis plant the very characteristic smell. You can find terpenes in flowers, vegetables, in grasses. And basically, they are very unique molecules that work hand in hand with the cannabinoids. Now, the plant that, so marijuana, which is defined as cannabis with a THC level greater than 0.3% per gram dry mass, that a major cannabinoid is called THC, which is psychotropic and causes a high. But there are so many other compounds that are called minor cannabinoids in there that are so effective as well. There are compounds in there such as CBN. Now, CBN, when cannabis gets harvested, is actually quite low in concentration, but over the aging process, CBN can increase in concentration, and it's now currently a big cannabinoid on the market for sleep products, because there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that people can sleep. It comes back from weed that was aged, and marijuana users were smoking it and falling asleep, calling couch weed. And when the cannabinoid was analyzed, it turns out it was CBN. There are other very, very important cannabinoids in there, such as CBG, which is a powerful anti-inflammatory, analgesic, and really helps with pain management. And what's amazing is that these minor cannabinoids, they can work hand in hand with these major cannabinoids like THC in an effect called the entourage effect. And I love explaining the entourage effect by saying, together you're stronger, 1 + 1 = 10. But the terpenes are the next ones that we need to really pay attention to. And there's lots of funding opportunities as well now by the National Institutes of Health to study terpenes for pain and nociception.
So, Dr. Kelly Dineen, your expertise is in law, and Holly writes in, can one of the panelists tell us exactly what the law in Nebraska is today regarding marijuana use, recreational and medicinal? And that also gets us into the petition drive that's out there as well. Can you elaborate on the law, where it is?
Yes, so Nebraska is one of the last 3 remaining states that has absolutely no laws that allow access to most, with the exceptions from the Farm Bill, which we'll talk about in a minute, but we have no recreational or medical marijuana nor special access programs to components of cannabis for medical use. So we have nothing. We're alone with Kansas and Idaho in having nothing. And so for a number of years, the most notable exception, or the most notable event recently was the 2020 election ballot initiatives. There was a ballot initiative that was fairly detailed and garnered all the required signatures appropriately, but it was challenged on procedure and its compliance with the single issue rule for ballot initiatives that's been in place in Nebraska since 1998. And so the Supreme Court decided in September of 2020 that ballot initiative could not be placed on the ballot for the general election in November because it tried to deal with 2 separate divisible issues that made it such that people could be forced to vote yes for medical use and vote for the whole thing, even if they were opposed to allowing businesses and private entities to cultivate and sell medical marijuana. And so now there are two new ballot initiatives that are on the Secretary of State's website for Nebraska, if you're interested. And based on the conclusions in that Supreme Court case, they're very simple. They're one-sentence ballot initiatives. And so we'll see what happens. We won't know, that won't be, it's not eligible to be put on the ballot until 2022. Right. So we've got a while to go, but those efforts continue.
Well, as Julia Court mentioned at the very top of our program, part of Nebraska Public Media's partnership with NOVA has been producing short videos around topics that connect science and society. And as we think about the cannabis question nationally, Nebraska Public Media's Bill Kelly and Mike Tobias looked at how the rise of the cannabis industry is being felt here in Nebraska.
These plants are cannabis, and they might be illegal in Nebraska. Or they might be legal. This cannabis is classified as hemp, and it's legal here. By law, to qualify as hemp, a plant must contain less than 0.3% THC, the main psychoactive substance in cannabis, a level so low it's not known to be intoxicating. That means in states like Nebraska, exceeding the narrow threshold for THC in hemp can result in a loss of an entire harvest.
We have to find some way to prevent entire crops from being destroyed if they're just above the illegal limit, right? That 0.3%.
THC content can rise or fall at any stage of breeding, growing, or processing.
Hemp is kind of like a little baby. It doesn't always do what you want it to do. So sometimes, depending on temperature and climate conditions, controlling the cannabinoid levels can be difficult. So it's not easy.
Cannabinoids are the compounds in cannabis that interact with specialized receptors in our brains and bodies. THC is just one of the ingredients that the plant can produce, sometimes up to levels of about 25 to 30%.
And we're down here trying to deal with 0.3% THC. So there's a huge difference.
Sweetwater Hemp began processing hemp in 2020. The company purchases the plant and extracts cannabinol, or CBD, another cannabinoid from the plant, but unlike THC, it does not produce a high. They've cultivated a couple of research crops in their greenhouses. Growers use genetics to engineer plants that repress their own THC content.
They keep being able to find that genetic, create that cannabinoid, and have that type of plant that creates that specific cannabinoid.
Where the hemp is planted may cause drastic swings in the THC level. Sweetwater recognized its research crop in one of its greenhouses produced high-quality plants that pushed the boundaries on THC content.
Those plants, they have the best of both worlds of not dealing with high extremes outside of wind and conditions and those kind of things, and they just really push and thrive really fast.
2 weeks before Sweetwater's anticipated harvest, state regulators are called to take random samples of the crop. The plants are sent to an independent lab. Nebraska-based Kennebec is one of the first in the state to get the needed certifications.
We take the sample, we grind it, we sieve it to get the seeds and the stems out. We grind it again to make a very, very fine powder. And then using organic solvents, we extract the cannabinoids.
The final report provides measurements of a whole range of cannabinoids and, most importantly, determines whether the THC falls within the 0.3% legal limit.
I think it's what's challenging for us, and we keep it always at the forefront, is how important and serious this measurement is. That it means the difference between harvesting and marketing a field of hemp or a greenhouse of hemp or destroying your crops.
If there is too much THC, the law demands every single plant in the batch be destroyed. Those black buckets are all that remains of a recent Sweetwater hemp crop that tested over 0.3.
I was 0.39 on my very first one. And 10 days before that, I was 0.26.
The team considers it to be part of the learning curve.
The first time you grew corn, was it perfect? No. The first time you grew soybeans, was it perfect? No.
Next step, turning the acquired plants into product. Even if the crop hits that legal THC mark, the same rules apply to what's extracted from the hemp. The flower gets hand stripped off the buds, which are soaked in ice water and filtered.
And it then goes through three filters before it comes out as bubble hash.
The bubble hash is blended with a concentrated version of coconut oil, which becomes the base ingredients for the dozens of CBD-based products on the market.
And the hard part about that is you want to be as close to that 0.3 as possible, because THC kind of has a bad reputation, but THC is going to help that product be better.
Some industry players and consumers think cannabis compounds like THC help boost the medicinal qualities of CBD, but scientists say we need more data. There's one other way hemp growers could stay out of trouble: change the federal law and increase the amount of THC allowed.
And I think raising the threshold on that would help, especially Nebraska farmers, with growing industrial hemp, so they don't have to be so diligent about catching that plant before it's gone over that limit.
Whether the law changes or not, those processing and marketing hemp see the crop has its own distinct place in the market, even in places where cannabis with higher levels of THC remains illegal.
Oh, it's amazing. And I really look forward to how it's going to change. I think that these plants have so much to offer in terms of medicinal properties and other things. There's a lot of good that comes out of this plant.
We want to remind you that you're watching Cannabis in Nebraska, Medicine, Agriculture, and the Law, presented by Nebraska Public Media and NOVA. I'm Nebraska Public Media News Director Dennis Kellogg. Dr. Andrea Holmes of Doane University in Nebraska, I want to start off by asking you a little bit about providing more context for us for hemp as a crop in Nebraska. And Alan writes in and says he wants to make sure people understand the difference between hemp and marijuana.
Sure. So the difference between hemp and marijuana is clear-cut, 0.3% THC per gram dry mass, which means anything at 0.3% or less is considered hemp, and anything above is considered marijuana. And in the state of Nebraska, the only cannabis that's allowed is hemp. So it has to test less than 0.3%. So let me give you a little bit of context with regards to the status quo of hemp in the state of Nebraska. When we finally were able to legally plant that cannabis, hemp in this case, it's like it was an amazing interest from farmers, because Nebraska farmers were looking for solutions and alternatives to corn and soybean and sugar beets and all of that, because the monetary return is just really hard right now for the Nebraskan farmer, and so they're looking for other crops. Now, the downside of it is that we're a little bit behind the ball game, and all the other states who have done this for many, many years, they know how to grow this plant very well, and we had to go onto the learning curve, and it's a steep learning curve, in particular with regards to growing conditions and how do you grow hemp so it doesn't go over that compliance level So it's a growing pain right now. So a lot of Nebraskans who are cultivating hemp also had to learn the hard way that outside conditions for hemp when it's grown for cannabinoids is tough, because we have a lot of cross-pollination out there, and so the end product then contains a lot of seed, or the cannabinoid levels are not as high and enriched. And so not every hemp farmer who thought, oh yeah, I can jump onto this new lucrative crop can do it, because they don't. Because an indoor grow would be preferred. So there's a lot of different complexities, but also the first complexity is some farmers didn't even know that there's a difference between, industrial hemp that can be grown for fiber and materials and all these other applications, or that hemp can be grown for health and wellness properties, the extraction of cannabinoids. And also the Nebraskans at first didn't really know, what field do I go into? Do I want to do cultivation and farming? Do I want to do extraction? Do I want to do processing? Well, how do I do processing? What do I do with THCs? There's just so many questions. That's partly also why our program was so very popular, because these are all questions that are being addressed, and we're getting smarter. But even the Nebraskans didn't learn how to grow corn overnight. It took some time, and we're going to do the same thing with hemp.
Sarah Holt, I want to ask you, in the course of making this film, you visited with many consumers and sellers of CBD. So what are some of their experiences trying to navigate that marketplace?
Well, to me, I think it's interesting when I would speak to researchers like Yasmin or Matt Hill. They would tell me you have to have 100 milligrams of CBD for it to be detected in your blood. And yet you see the products in the dispensaries, 10 milligrams, 20 milligrams. And I said to them, so is this effective? And, Yasmin and I think Matt said it could be a placebo effect. I mean, Yasmin, maybe you could speak about that, but I feel like that it's marketed everywhere, and people need to know this is voter-approved cannabis. Most of these products haven't been tested, and they're not even required necessarily to be tested for contaminants and molds and pesticides and heavy metals. If there's no THC in a CBD product in California, those products are like vitamin supplements. So when they a few years ago, they pulled them off the shelf, and a lot of them did not have the amount of CBD they said they would have, and they had other things you don't want to be taking. Yasmin, can you chime in on that?
No, absolutely. This is the worry that we have when medicine is decided on by election. We have in our society that there's a process for what we consider medicine, and for whatever reason, CBD and cannabis products have been led to believe that you can vote on it, and this is a huge issue. Definitely, there are components of the cannabis plant that have, I think, medicinal properties, but you have to actually prove it. So, coming back to the dose, there are definitely conditions where low dose CBD may be effective. A lot of times when we're studying different disorders, we're studying the pathological end. And so that may require those high doses that we use for research. But no one is studying the lower end. So when people put out their ads and say, oh, the CBD, helps with that, Andrea, with sleep or inflammation and pain, we have to prove it. No one goes to their, I would say, when you go to the pharmacy and you take a bottle of aspirin was from the bark of a willow tree. We processed it. We found out what was the active ingredient that was leading to this bark, helping with pain, being an analgesic. And now we know exactly what dose of aspirin you should take, and it's in the store, and the companies stand by it, and it's regulated. So it's the same way, I think, for me, that cannabis products should be developed as medicine. What's the concentration for a particular condition, for minor pain or for sleep, versus what we might need for people with schizophrenia or people who have an opioid use disorder? It will be different. And so unless we have these, structured clinical studies, we will never get to cannabis as a medicine. So it's not debated. I think this debate is because we We took it away from being a medicine.
Can I chime in also? Or is there another question? I just wanted to say that
you can, and I want to bring Kelly in.
I wanted to echo what Yasmin said with regards to studies and scientific research and clinical trials is absolutely necessary to determine what we're going to do with all these amazing cannabinoids in this treasure trove of cannabis. Fortunately, we do have a little bit of information, but the unique part is not everybody's endocannabinoid system is the same. And so right now, we still have to do a lot of self-titration and self-study in order to figure out what the optimum dose is. And I also wanted to say that there's something called bioavailability, and some products that you find in dispensaries and in CBD stores have different bioavailabilities because there's so many products. Inhalation, for example, offers to be one of the best bioavailabilities, whereas an edible goes through the entire metabolism, and yes, and not much ends up in the bloodstream. So again, consumer education is key.
You know, I just would like to say something. I'm sure I think the entourage effect, that theory seems to make sense, that taking cannabinoids together maybe boosts their impact. But I know there are clinical trials now underway studying to see whether the entourage effect is real. But I don't think there's any study that's been finished that can say definitively that it works.
Indeed, actually the opposite. Again, depending on what your outcome measure is, if you combine THC and CBD, you can get a boost of effect, or you can actually get a diminishing of effect. So that's when Dr. Russo used that term entourage to start, it's a catchy phrase, but it's actually not proven. It's just for certain conditions and dose. So certain concentrations of THC with certain concentrations of CBD may increase certain outcome variables, but we never ask for any other medicine. Your cardiologist wouldn't say, go and try and find the right dose for your heart problem. Yet still we're saying to people, go and self-medicate to find the right dose or the combination of cannabinoids that fit your condition. We have to create medicine, and we shouldn't really jump across the process that's needed, but we definitely should not criminalize. And that's one of the things for me, obviously, Kelly, this is your thing, but because I think that we put them in the same category, and they're not. Medicine is medicine, and cannabis shouldn't be criminalized to the point of absurdity that has been in our country.
So that leads us into a couple of questions that have come in for Dr. Dineen. Tina talks about, would you say that there needs to be deregulation of cannabis at a federal level in order to provide consumers a safe end product? And Todd says, is there any chance that they can reduce the class of cannabis instead of a class 1 down to a class 3 or 4 at least? From a legal perspective, Dr. Dineen, what would you say to that?
I'd say absolutely to the second question. It's actually within the purview of the Attorney General of the United States under the Controlled Substance Act, and that responsibility has been delegated to the DEA administrator. Could decide to do a rescheduling, and there are a number of criteria and things you have to follow, but that's definitely something that could happen. Indeed, the DEA could decide to consider one of the many citizens petitions that it has at any given time to consider rescheduling marijuana. And this has serious, I think the previous discussion really illustrates sort of a kind of a classic dilemma when it comes to drug policy, because so many drugs have either a currently accepted medical use or potential medical use, right? So we sit at this clash of cultures between public health and health promotion and trying to, grow the arsenal of treatments, and the sort of moral and sort of that view of drug use as potential remedies for many things, and also drug use as and substance use disorder as a medical condition, right? And then sort of the law enforcement position of punishing certain behaviors, right? And the goals of that, and sort of, that does have an underlying sort of morality, orientation to it, right? And then you've got consumer protection, which is the FDA's role, right? And they're all sort of in this quagmire together, and the laws that work for one of them, often make the other nearly impossible, right? So the fact that marijuana is in Schedule 1, which means it has no currently accepted medical use, and it has one of the highest potentials for abuse, which we know is not true, irrelevant to the, relative to the other drugs. But it also created exceptional barriers to research, right? Yeah. There are multiple administrative hurdles and permissions and special licensing that one has to invest in if they want to research these compounds. And so taking it out of Schedule 1 would make that possible. But it's a complicated legal question. But you could do that without amending the law. Yeah.
Okay, so we've heard about the current laws about cannabis and impacting growers and consumers, but we also want to examine this, as we have been doing a little bit, through the lens of the criminal justice system. So this clip from the film takes us through a little bit of the history of criminalization of cannabis, and we hear the story of how one person, Sean Worsley, was significantly impacted by possessing medical cannabis that was legal in one state, but illegal in another. Let's talk about the racial part of all of this as well. Looking at the data, disparities in marijuana arrests are quite stark. If we look at a nationwide analysis undertaken by the ACLU last year, in one of their reports, they looked at the FBI's crime statistics from 2018. Nationwide, Black people are 3.6 times more likely than white people to be arrested for marijuana possession. And in every state, Black people are arrested at higher rates than white people for marijuana possession. In Nebraska statewide, that rate is 3.1 times more likely, but yet federal data show usage rates between Blacks and whites are similar. So Dr. Kelly Dineen, you specialize in how the law treats people with substance use disorders, addiction, and other issues. How do you start to unpack what goes into creating this disparity?
Well, it's, multifactorial, and it doesn't end with arrest. Because once somebody's arrested, there are decisions to prosecute that have to be made, and prosecutors are about twice as likely to recommend more extensive prosecution of Black defendants than white defendants, right? And it extends to incarceration. So 60% of people in state prisons for drug offenses are either Black or Latino. 80% of federal people in federal prisons for drug offenses are Black or Latino. And yet they use at the same rates, right? And, of course it's multifactorial, but the thing is that if you look at the history, and it was mentioned in a previous clip, of major drug legislation in this country, the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 being one example, the Controlled Substance Act of 1970 being another, and some of its amendments in the 80s, including the sentencing disparity between smoked quote-unquote crack and powder cocaine, had an explicit and implicit racial or country of origin bias and goal. All right. The former Nixon administrative officials have gone on the record and said, look, we explicitly saw this as a way of socially controlling people who we perceived as using a lot of marijuana, who we associated with the anti-Vietnam War protest and effort, so-called hippies, right? And as a way to control communities of color, who they saw as in contrast to their social agendas, right? So you have the initial motivation, then you have the overlap with socioeconomic and where people live, right? So if I am in a gated community and I decide to have some pot one night, there's very little risk that any law enforcement officer is going to come and wonder what I'm doing, right? If I live in multifamily housing in a heavily surveilled area in the first instance, the risk is a lot higher, right? And we also know from data on drug arrest and frankly police shootings that claims about drug use, right, are pervasive in those narratives, whether as an excuse for feeling in fear of one's life or as the basis for engaging in an encounter in the first place. The smell of marijuana is one of the top reasons that's offered, right? And so we have these disparities and we need to really do some work to fix them. And it's not easy work.
Yeah, it isn't. It isn't. And Sarah Holt, I want to bring you in here. Lynn writes in, anyone want to address the racial issues that led to the cultural education against marijuana? You've said, Sarah, that you cannot talk about cannabis without talking about racism. So can you elaborate more on how you tackled that in the Cannabis Question film?
Well, I mean, I was astounded when I realized that drugs were the leading cause for arrest. And in this country, and a huge number of those arrests are cannabis arrests, and they're for possession charges. And just the whole becoming aware of mass incarceration in this country, disproportionately affecting people of color, it seemed to me to be a tool of oppression. And one of the arguments, you hear people worry about the harms of the teen brain, and one reason why we shouldn't legalize cannabis, but one reason I cared about this story is that we don't often see the public health disaster of the war on drugs. You know, how Sean becomes homeless, he has a stroke. Ebony, when she's called back, because they're called back to Alabama, she has a heart attack while she's waiting in jail, while they're waiting for the outcome of their trial. This arrest has been devastating for their health. They weren't able to see their children. I mean, it just ricocheted all the way down in terms of, it was hard to get an apartment, it was hard to get a job. And, this is one story. I mean, sadly, there were so many I could choose from. And so I really wanted to make the point that the war on drugs isn't keeping us safer. It's disproportionately targeting people of color. A lot of people would say to me, oh, it's the era of legalization. That's history. It's history for you if you're white, but not if you are Black. I think that officer in Alabama could have used discretion. And if Sean had been white, he might not have charged him as severely as he did. So it was shocking to me in this day and age. We have cannabis as an essential service and people are making a lot of money. And that at the same time, Sean basically almost had a death sentence because he went into prison at the peak of COVID. He could have gotten COVID and died.
Dr. Yasmin Hurd, how do you see the impacts of these cannabis laws in your work trying to do research with cannabis as a Schedule I drug?
I'm going to just add one thing. So definitely, as I've spoken about, I study cannabis on the developing brain, and I study the neurobiology of substance use disorder in general. But all of the challenges of drugs has a huge impact on the brain. Kids, Sarah talked about the children of the parents who are locked up, the communities that have been destroyed by this. They've destroyed communities. It impacts on the developing brain. So public health, also a neuroscience failure as well, a psychiatric failure. And this is one of the things that we have to realize. So yes, scheduling for me as a researcher was definitely challenging in terms of doing studies with cannabis and cannabidiol. And definitely the 2018 Farm Bill helped for hemp-derived CBD, helped to at least today, to be able to work with CBD without jumping through many hoops. But I have to say, CBD, whether or not it's derived from cannabis plant or from a hemp cannabis plant, it's CBD. So it makes no sense that we have this thing that if CBD is derived from hemp plant, then it's okay, but CBD derived from a pure cannabis plant isn't. It is that's why you should have regulations where you can see whether or not you test the CBD, whether or not it's pure CBD and there's no THC or less than 0.3% or whatever other cannabinoids. These are the things that government officials make these rules and don't realize chemistry is chemistry and biology is biology. It makes no sense. So these are the things, unless they're going to include scientists, chemists, biologists in the discussion, that's why we've had this problem. We would never have gone down this path, destroyed people's lives, destroyed communities, and I think increased addiction, to be honest. When you criminalize a whole community, the stress, and Matt Hill talked about the stress of the endocannabinoid system, we created more substance use disorders. We created more psychiatric disorders. We created more health disorders. Then we say, oh, it's absurd. So we have to get together as a community and have all the people in the room to be part of the discussion of how do you get out of this? Because all these people making billions of dollars now on cannabis, they're not giving it to the communities that have been, tortured by it. We need to do something about that.
Yeah, and can I just add quickly? Oh, sorry.
Sure,
okay.
sure.
Just
go
quickly,
ahead.
that
Go ahead, Dr.
we have to encourage and exert political pressure from the public on the lawmakers to listen to the experts in the room, because there have been, time after time, there have been lots of good evidence and reports from experts in the field that have been disregarded and contributed to this unmitigated disaster that is the war on drugs for public health.
We're kind of running towards the end of our conversation here, but we've gotten several questions on a topic that I want to bring Dr. Andrea Holmes of Doane University in on, and that has to do with Delta 8. We have Lorraine and Mark and others that have been asking, what is Delta 8? Why is it legal? A Delta 8 dispensary has recently opened in someone's community, and how is this allowed? What are the concerns with Delta 8? Can you just briefly kind of tell us a little bit about Delta 8?
Sure. Delta 8 is a very important minor cannabinoid that can be found in cannabis, and currently it falls under a legal loophole, and it is federally legal in Nebraska. It's currently legal because it is a hemp-derived cannabinoid. So what happens is that CBD can be extracted from hemp, and it can be chemically converted into Delta 8 THC, and that's why right now it's considered legal. There's a lot of other states in the United States that have actually outlawed Delta 8, but currently in Nebraska it is legal. And what's important to know about Delta 8 THC is that it is also a psychotropic cannabinoid, and it can induce a high, and it can induce a sense of euphoria, and people must be aware of that. It has other properties that are important, health and wellness properties. And unfortunately, at this point, we, again, like many other of these cannabinoids that are minor, don't have a whole lot of research and data. But there's one study that I am aware of where Delta 8 THC has been used for chemotherapy pediatric patients to help with nausea and vomiting. But that is just one clinical trial that I am aware of. What's extremely important is if people do consider Delta 8 THC is that they do go to a reputable store that can demonstrate that these products have been tested for contaminants, that these products are free of pesticides, free of heavy metals, that they show a certificate of analysis that shows that it's compliant in Delta 9 THC. And there are reputable vendors and retail outlets with reputable professionals in Nebraska. Somebody who wants to know if their product is safe, they should ask for the certificate of analysis and have the retail expert explain it.
Great, good answer. The film from Nova is The Cannabis Question, and Sarah Holt is the producer, director, and writer of that film. And so, Sarah, as we wrap up our conversation, I want to ask you, what would you like to see people take away from this film?
I think one thing I hope they'll realize is that when they use cannabis, they're engaging this powerful regulatory system in their body and brain. It doesn't mean that it's, necessarily bad or good. It's such an important system. And I hope people realize that they are, in effect, interfering with how it's working.
And we'll leave it at that. Thank you all so much for a very engaging conversation tonight. A lot of great questions and a lot to think about. We also appreciate all of the questions that we received from our audience tonight. This has been Cannabis in Nebraska, Medicine, Agriculture, and the Law, presented by Nebraska Public Media and Nova. I'm Dennis Kellogg, News Director for Nebraska Public Media, and my thanks to our four panelists, filmmaker Sarah Holt, director, writer, and producer of The Cannabis Question, Dr. Yasmin Hurd, director of the Addiction Institute at Mount Sinai, Dr. Andrea Holmes, professor of chemistry and director of cannabis studies at Doane University, and also Dr. Kelly Deneen, director of the Health Law program at Creighton University Law School. We also want to thank our community partners for their help in planning this event: Creighton University School of Law's Health Law program, Doane University's Canada Studies Department, Inclusive Communities, Kennebec Analytical Services, University of Nebraska Medical Center College of Pharmacy, University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Department of Agronomy and Horticulture. And also many thanks to Gina Varamo and Maggie Barrett. Watch Nova's The Cannabis Question on Wednesday, September 29th. That's at 8 Central on Nebraska Public Media or online on Nova's website or YouTube channel. And for more resources, visit our website, nebraskapublicmedia.org/cannabis. Thanks again so much for joining us tonight, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.